Our third speaker for this session, before we have a break, is Professor Phil Bland from Curtin University. Phil has a very active group at Curtin University. In fact, we have several speakers here today. After the break, another 2 speakers actually from Curtin. And they're doing some absolutely fantastic projects. One of them is Desert Fireball, which you'll hear Ellie talk about a little, I suspect, after the break. Phil is going to talk to us about mud in space. Over to you, Phil.
Alrighty, thank you. And that's my little hoobajoo. Okay, great. So, hi, folks. Thank you all for coming, and thanks everybody in the town of Murchison for making us all so welcome. It's been a really lovely couple of days. We've all really enjoyed it, and it's been a great event. So you've heard from quite a few people about what does Murchison mean to them, and I think a lot of people have different stories. I'm going to say I think I've got you all beat, right? So Gretchen Benedict's, we heard from her yesterday on the origin of water in the solar system. I'm fortunate enough to be married to Gretchen. We met at scientific conferences in studying meteorites, and we think that our first proper conversation was about doing a collaboration studying the Murchison meteorite. So, which means that Murchison is responsible not only for my wife, but also for my 2 children. So I'm just going to, I think I win. So today I'm going to tell you a little bit. We've heard an awful lot about some of the components in the meteorite and their origin. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about the processes that we think were going on kind of inside the entire asteroid in the early solar system. So a lot of this stuff, Trevor talked yesterday about some of the age dating and how a lot of the activity in asteroids and in the early solar system happened over a relatively short period of time. That's a fact. I mean, you know, Earth has been active for 4.5 billion years. In terms of the activity in asteroids in the early solar system, it really didn't go that much for most of them, more than like 10, 20 million years, and then they all kind of quieted down. In a few cases, they carried on longer, but in other areas, not. Now, the title of my talk is Geophysical Evolution of the Murchison Asteroid, but I think that's a much more fun one. So what I hope to convince you of by the end of the talk is that Murchison actually came from a giant blob of mud around about 200 kilometers across, something like that. And I will point out, all of this work is done with my colleague Brian Travis. His computer modeling was fantastic, was central to all of this. Brian originally was from Los Alamos National Lab, where they do all the, computer models there are mostly done for a very different purpose, but happily he was willing to share some of his knowledge and apply it to this. So first, what is geophysics? So geophysics is basically, as it's in the name, applying physics to explain things about rocks, geo of the Earth. Now it's gone kind of beyond the Earth, and so we kind of apply geophysics in a planetary concept as well. And kind of central to this is really thinking about how planets lose heat. And if we kind of come at stuff from that point of view, rather than kind of focusing on the details of this planet works this way and this planet works another way, then it kind of fits together a little more clearly. But central to the way that the Earth loses heat is the process of plate tectonics, which carries heat from the interior to close to the surface, and then that's radiated out into space. On Venus, it doesn't work quite as well, so Venus cooks up an awful lot more, and then probably releases heat at the surface in sudden bursts like that. So we lose heat better if we have this process called convection going on in the interior. We had a really nice introduction from Andy yesterday into plate tectonics and how that changed geology. We think that essentially it's a lot more complicated than this, but it's a process of convection in the Earth's interior that drives moving plates on the Earth's surface, and that leads to kind of cracks in the middle of the oceans called mid-ocean ridges, and builds mountains where plates kind of crash into each other. But it's these convection currents down below that do that, and it happens everywhere. So when you boil a kettle, you'll see kind of circulation in the kettle. That's a convection current. And if you make a cup of tea and you don't stir the milk very well, you'll see different cells in there of convection currents. Try it out. That's basically hot stuff coming up from down below, cooling at the surface, and then that liquid dropping down again and to form a little cycle. So I've been interested for a while in geophysics of asteroids. How did asteroids as entire bodies work in the early solar system? Can we do something similar in terms of explanations there to what we've done on Earth with plate tectonics? And the interesting thing, although these objects are much smaller, is that there's been really no agreement in how they kind of worked as single small planets. We've got this great theory for the Earth. Plate tectonics explains virtually everything about how the Earth works. There's for asteroids, it's nowhere near that good. You've got basically disagreements across the entire range of possible models. I think it'd be nice to nail that, to kind of explain that, because all of the terrestrial planets formed from these rocks. So kind of nice to know, because we come from there, and we actually really do come from there, because as a number of people have said, the water in your bodies, the organic material in your bodies, originally came from these objects. So it'd kind of be nice to know how they worked in the early solar system. So we've heard a little bit about carbonaceous chondrites. Murchison is a type of meteorite called carbonaceous chondrite. Philip explained that it's only like 4% of all meteorites, carbonaceous chondrites. You've heard a couple of people call them chemically pristine. I'll tell you a little bit about what that means in a second. And Mike was just talking about how rocks like Murchison have seen an awful lot of water, and that's kind of putting those together is a little bit weird. The other thing that's sort of a wrinkle in about meteorites like Murchison is that they all got altered by that water at quite low temperatures, and almost all of them, actually, it was over a fairly narrow range. It's like 20 degrees to 150 degrees centigrade. And if you think of, here's a 200-kilometer diameter asteroid, how do you manage to maintain not much more than about 100-degree temperature range in that asteroid? You get almost more of a temperature range, let's say, at the Earth's surface than occurred in these asteroids, which is kind of wacky, given that they cook it up from the inside. So to get into a little bit more detail on this, chemically pristine, right? So we've got water flowing through these things. Mike pointed out we actually have salt in them. Now, if you flow water through a chunk of rock that's got salt in it, then the salt goes away. So how come we've actually still got sodium and chlorine in these rocks? If there's a CM chondrite, the vast majority of the elements of the minerals in there are caused by reacting with water. They're not original. They've been created by reacting with water. They've seen a lot of water, but it's not done much to the chemistry. It's nice if you want to actually cool down an asteroid, as we saw with the Earth, if you have got circulation. So if you do have water flowing through it, those big convection currents, that's good for cooling it down, for keeping the temperature fairly low inside. Otherwise, the things like a pressure cooker, it'll cook up, and you'll get much higher temperatures. And we don't see those in CM chondrites. So putting those things together is a little weird. Mike did point out there are veins in these things, but they're kind of hard to pick out. You've got to look, you've got to look around. They're not everywhere, no. And so that's also quite hard to do if you're trying to explain, cells of convecting material that are going through like 100 kilometers through these objects. And the oxygen isotopes also look a little bit like the water was flowing. Now, this is not quite the only graph that I'll show, the only figure that I'll show like this. But it's one of my favorites. This is the abundance of 56 elements in meteorites compared to the sun. Now, the sun isn't just hydrogen and helium. If you take all of the gas out of the sun, all of the elements that are there in a gaseous form, you remove all of those, there is stuff left, and it's all the stuff that makes up us and the Earth, and there's all of those elements represented in the sun. Now, what's kind of wacky is if you compare the abundance of those elements in meteorites that are like, this is not exactly like Murchison, but similar to the composition of the sun, then it's almost identical. So how did that happen? Well, the sun is basically the average composition of the solar system. The disk that was outside of the sun, that all the planets formed from, was broadly similar composition. And that's got moved around by processes in the disk and then processes in the asteroids. What's kind of wacky about these meteorites is it really didn't move things around very much. The solid blobs here are soluble elements. So they are elements like sodium and chlorine and fluorine. And those elements are within, 15, 10, in some cases 5% in the meteorite of their abundance in the sun, which is pretty wacky. Because some of those elements, you almost breathe on them and they go away. So how did we do that? So Mike did show some veins, I'm sorry. So I'm looking at that and I can't see any, which means that there were giant this is the difference, right? Giant circulation cells in these meteorites. So this is the meteorite Allende on the left-hand side, which a couple of people have talked about, and Murchison on the right. Now, when you do zoom in a little bit, and this is a slice through the Allende meteorite. This is actually an analysis done with the synchrotron in Melbourne, and it's a mixed element map. I can't exactly remember what the colors stand for on this one. Apologies, but you do see some veins here. But when you try and map out, okay, how far have they carried elements? It's not that far. It's like over the order of a few hundreds of microns, not kilometers or tens of kilometers, which is what you'd need to do to carry the heat out from the middle of that asteroid. We've had over the last 30, 40 years, lots of really nice computer simulations of how we think, different people's ideas for how asteroids work. In all of those, the assumption has been that you've been pushing water through rock, right? So Murchison is a rock. If we imagine how that interacted back in the early solar system, then we assume that its asteroid was a rock and that water maybe was flowing through it. Now, how we started this really was okay. Well, what if it wasn't, right? If when this material first accreted, when it first came together to form an asteroid, it was just little particles of dust, and then what you've seen people refer to as chondrites, these little spherical inclusions. You can just think of it as grit for the moment, and then ice. And there was also elements inside, radioactive elements, that when they heated up the whole object, the ice melted, and then we started to have that water react with the dust and the chondrites. But at the moment that happened, at the moment that the ice melted, nothing's happened to squish those materials together and turn them into a rock. So we wondered, okay, well, let's go with the assumption that when ice melts, you get a mud, and let's start with that for our computer model. Now, Craig showed some awesome computer models yesterday about how the Earth responded to giant impacts. It's worth pointing out, really, that people, when you see those models about how the moon formed, about with Craig's stuff as well, many geologists look at those and think that they're cartoons, right? That they're kind of artist impressions. They're not. It's people who create those computer models. Basically, what you're doing is in every single cell, if you think of it like each pixel in those models, you're basically saying, okay, this is how the physics of how that like composition of the material in that cell is going to respond to the next ones around it. If I've got a temperature down here that's high and the temperature on the surface that's low, what's that going to do to that cell, and how's it going to respond to its nearest neighbors? And the more cells you've got, the bigger a computer you need, the longer it takes. But it's basically how what the physical processes are on that tiny, tiny level. And then you just press go. It's a lot more complicated than that, and see what happens. So that's kind of what we did with this. We said, okay, it's not a rock. All of those materials can flow if they're able to. We began with the same sort of ratio of dust to chondrules to ice as we see in CM chondrites. And then we varied those a little bit after that to see, okay, what's the reaction in varying them. We varied the size of the object. So we started with something 100 kilometers across and went up to 1,000 kilometers across just to see what that did. And as I said, there's the heat source in meteorites is radioactive elements that were part of our disk right in the early solar system. They decayed really fast, and in that decay, they gave off a lot of heat. And so that's the process by which we think the planets actually differentiate, and we got an iron core and interesting things like that. But what it means is that the longer it took for your object to come together, the fewer of those elements are around. They start to decay right at the beginning, and then that process goes on and on. So if you're late with bringing your object together, there's less of them around, you've got less heat. So the earlier you bring your object together, the more heat. Later, the less heat. So we also varied the time that it took for them to come together. So first thing we got was that we found that all of the chondrules kind of drop to the core of the thing. So that's this area here. So you get a kind of a mixture of chondrules and mud in the core of it. Above that is a mud ocean. This thing's 200 kilometers across. That's what this model is doing. And then out here is an ice crust that never melts. It basically keeps most of the heat inside that object. Now these ones, that's where the particles are on this. So down here in this area, it's about 2/3 chondrules, about 1/3 matrix. Out here, it's basically all mud. And what these ones now show is the temperature through these objects, right? So this one is one of the little ones. This is a 100-kilometer object, and we pressed go on this one with a bit less water, a bit less ice, and we find temperatures kind of in this sort of region in the interior, which is about right for our carbonaceous chondrites. We didn't set it to do that at the beginning. That was an outcome of the model, and that's good news for us. It kind of seems like, okay, we're on the right track. Now, the other good thing is that we're kind of in the right region in terms of the temperatures that we see. We think that the minerals in the meteorites have been exposed to. The other good thing is that it's pretty much the same temperature, like all the way through, right? So you've got, here's an object that's 100 kilometers across, getting cooked up from the inside out, but because it's all of that mud is moving around in it, it's kind of stirring the pot, and you get the same temperature throughout it. So in the end, where we got Murchison, we would have smashed that up, and we would have got all those other CM chondrites that Mike's talked about, and they all have roughly the same kind of temperatures. They've all seen roughly the same sort of temperatures. So both those things are a good result. This is a bigger one with a bit less water, but still same kind of temperature range, and still all mixed up on the inside. And a larger object again with a bit more water, but same sort of temperature range again. So basically what we found was we can change a lot of those conditions, and that's not me. And a lot of those conditions, and you still end up with something that looks quite like a CM chondrite in terms of the temperature that the meteorite itself has been exposed to. Okay, so initial conclusions. That convection of mud through the interior, and there's other images, there's other parts of the model I can show you that where we see that a little more clearly, those convection cells, means that we get roughly the same temperatures throughout the interior of it, and because it's a bit more efficient at kind of carrying heat out, it keeps the temperature inside lower. It's all being mixed up, right? So you're not pushing water through rock anymore. You're not stripping out your sodium and chlorine and fluorine. Those elements are getting carried around with the water just like they would in the mud. So when we analyze it, we keep our nice sunlight chemistry. And all of that actually looks quite a lot like CM chondrite. So I'm going to say Murchison came from a giant mud ball, maybe 200 kilometers across. What we also found was if you've got more ice, then there's less heating. Those radioactive elements are in the rock, not in the ice. So if you've got relatively more ice, there's less heating. And if it comes together late, then we've got less heating. And that actually is quite a neat explanation for the difference between comets and asteroids. Just having more water there, just having more ice there, limits the chance of the thing actually melting in the first place. So you can have something like Murchison with that ratio of material just melt enough to kind of start the whole process going. Next door, if it's got about 20% more ice, never melts. So that's kind of a nice explanation for that difference. And the other wrinkle that's kind of cute is that the more grit there is and the less mud, the more difficult it is to get that whole cycle going. So those other meteorites that we look at, those other chondrites, are often seeing much higher temperatures than CMs. And it's quite nice. That may be an explanation for that difference between different chondrite types. Now, I'm going to just finish with a little bit. So this is me just looking at, this is work that a colleague did. He came to a different conclusion. I think he's wrong. But I think a lot of the textures that he's seen in here kind of look like what I would expect if I was looking at a rock and that had been flowing mud. So those are scanning electron microscope images. And I think those kind of look like, I'm going to squint at that and say that looks like flowing mud. And I'm going to finish up with a story about Ceres, and that is relevant to some of the conversations that people are having about life and life in the solar system. So Ceres is the largest object in the asteroid belt. It accounts for about a third of the entire mass of the asteroid belt. It's one object. It's 1,000 kilometers across, and it was visited by the Dawn spacecraft a few years ago, first time, which mapped it and got a lot of information about its internal structure. So we thought, okay, so this all seems to work for CM chondrites. Let's model something 1,000 kilometers across. We find the same sort of thing. So all the particles kind of drop into a core, and we've got this sort of mud ocean above that. And then we looked at, so all of these next ones are just going to be the temperature inside these objects. So this is kind of a slice, if you imagine, through that entire object, through the center of it. What is the temperature? How does that vary throughout those objects? And in this is 100 million years after Ceres forms, and it's dropped down. We've lost a bit, so it's not quite as hot as some of those other objects that we looked at. These ones are kind of cute. So what we find is that in this one, there's sort of an upwelling around the equator. So you get sort of high temperatures here going through this mud ocean. We go on a bit in time. So this is 200 million years after it formed, 225. Temperatures dropping a little bit. These are all kind of cute little more convection cells right at the top. And then we're going on a little bit in time. Now we're at 1 billion years after it formed, but we're still at, it's hard to do, 30 degrees in the interior. And although we're starting to lose nice circulation now, the interior is actually still warm at that sort of time. So what's kind of interesting is that we get, in Ceres, the model showed us that right in the interior of the core, it started at relatively high temperatures. So that's around 200 degrees centigrade, dropped fairly rapidly. But once he gets here, it actually just stays fairly constant. And what we think is, on the basis of this model, that Ceres is actually still warm, wet, organic rich in the interior. That doesn't mean there's any life there, but it probably means that if you put bugs in right at the beginning, they'd still be kind of, or their distant ancestors would be relatively happy now. Thank you.
Thanks, Phil. We thought these things were just inert objects in space. So we have a question for the break. John, I'll give you the mic.
Thanks, Phil. My question is about the short-lived radio elements. And I guess I couldn't quite understand, you know, we're saying that the time of accretion matters, late versus early in terms of heat, but when were these radio elements created? Surely it was the previous phase of nuclear synthesis, so surely the time from creation to the short time of accretion is much larger than the period of accretion.
So your question has been argued about by generations of planetary scientists pretty much for my entire career. So there's a couple of options there. When I started out doing my PhD, people talked an awful lot about the idea that there was a supernova close to where the solar system was forming, and that dumped these elements into our region, maybe even triggered the collapse of our part of the cloud. And so we got a kind of a dose of these short-lived radionuclides just before we accreted. There's other ideas that basically that a cloud has got multiple kind of supernovae popping off, so you've essentially got kind of an average composition of short-lived stuff throughout that cloud. So it's people have been arguing about that for a long, long time, and they argue about whether it's evenly distributed in our disk or there's variation. But what is clear is that there were a lot of, the main one is aluminium-26. It was bizarrely abundant, but it looks to have roughly the same abundance in other areas of the galaxy where young stars are popping off. So we might not be so special in that respect.
Thanks, Phil. I think we might stop that there.
Okay.
And I'd like to thank Phil for coming with quite a big team and kids as well, all linked to Murchison and back to Murchison. So thanks very much.
Thanks very much. Cheers, buddy. Awesome. Thank you.